Rob, it's a really good point that you make. So look, my take on it is there's two major issues facing the government at the moment. One is the inflation, housing, cost of living crisis, which really is caused by COVID and some of the inflationary measures on the back of COVID with supply chains being broken, et cetera, et cetera. The other one is skills crisis. And international students sit right in the middle of those two major issues.
G'day and welcome to the Global Horizons podcast. I'm Rob Malicki, one of the co-hosts of the show. Global Horizons is Australia's international education podcast where in each episode we're focusing on the stories that make our industry just so great to work in. Sometimes those stories will be industry news and current affairs, and other times we're going to dive into the personal careers and travel stories of a guest who joins us on the show. We're also going to have episodes dedicated to unpacking industry trends or to helping you understand the nuances of one of the specialisations that we have in Australian international education. That might be learning abroad or international marketing, ELICOS or compliance, or one of the many other sub-disciplines. Our goal is to unpack the knowledge, the stories, and the impact of this wonderful thing that is Australian international education. And hey, if you want to be part of it, you can support Global Horizons by hitting subscribe in your favourite podcast app or by contacting us, info@globalsociety.com.au, info@globalsociety.com.au with your ideas and suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. And now, without further ado, on to our first episode of the show. And we're kicking off with a current news episode. So today I'm joined by Dirk Mulder, the editor of The Koala News, which is Australia's dedicated international education news website, for an analysis of the top stories touching our industry right now. I hope you enjoy the show.
I'm Dirk Mulder and I'm the editor of Australia's international education news site, The Koala News. And today I'm coming to you from Perth, Western Australia.
And g'day, I'm Rob Malicki. I'm the CEO of the Global Society. And today I'm in Melbourne on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. And Dirk, AIEC, the Australian International Education Conference, the 37th edition, kicks off next week in Adelaide. But before we get on to that, this week seems to have been a massive week full of a flurry of announcements from government. Can you tell listeners what's been going on? Because there seems to have been quite a lot.
Right, it sure has. It probably all stems the release of the Nixon Review, which is a bit of a rapid review into the quality of the immigration system and some of the downfalls of the immigration system over the last little bit. So Christine Nixon, who was, I think, the police commissioner from Victoria, was announced back in January to carry out the report. That's obviously landed. Now the government's had, I think, 3 announcements in a row in as many days. On the back of that, started Sunday night with a release that went out under embargo, and that was all about strengthening the integrity measures within international education. And the major ones that came out of that was around some of the standards to hold provider registration or prevent ownership of businesses between education providers and education agents, the prohibition of agent commissions on student transfers between providers in Australia, to remove those incentives for unscrupulous agents and providers to poach students. And the third major announcement was around providers would be given greater access to agent performance data, and that's probably been coming for quite some time. The first up announcement, a big one, lots to take there. It'll be really interesting to see how the rubber hits the road on that. What we've seen over many years is when we see announcements like this, they work for a period of time and then people start to figure out their ways around them. So the one that I'm really interested in at the moment in that context is around the strengthening of the standards to gain and hold provider registration and prevent cross-ownership of businesses between education providers and education agents. So we all know that we have agents that have gone into college ownerships, and that creates pipelines. And I think the whole auspices of this is to break those pipelines, and that'll probably work for a little bit. We'll break the pipeline, we'll break the connection. But what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years' time? Will we see these same providers with cousins or family members that own different businesses under different names? Will they regain some sort of traction, or will this be enough to stop it? I think it's a really good first up approach from the government, but time will tell whether it actually comes through.
They do look like pretty common sense measures to me on the surface, plugging what seem to be some fairly obvious gaps. As you're saying, transferring ownership to family members, that does seem like a fairly easy option though for if people are trying to get around the system. How effective do you think they're likely to be?
Like I said, I think if we look at it through a short-term, medium-term, long-term, in the short term, this will break business models, right? So that's what we're after. We're after seeing the transparency come back. It's really the medium and longer term, I think, that we need to keep our eye on. We can't be the only industry that faces these issues, right? So there's got to be examples out there. And I think that's probably the next step, is to start looking at what other industries where there are pipeline effects and how are they broken? How do you maintain that transparency?
Yeah, great. And there was definitely more that was announced, wasn't there?
There sure was. That's just the first of three. Yesterday, there was an announcement around vet integrity. And it was a joint announcement from the three ministers: O'Neill from Home Affairs, Claire from Education, and O'Connor from Skills and Training. Given that it was obviously focused on the vet sector, O'Connor really took the lead and followed up a release that came out yesterday morning with an appearance at the National Press Club in the afternoon. And that was post a breakfast interview with Patricia Cavallos on ABC. So some really interesting points that came out of that. In terms of, I guess, the highlights, we're talking about a new integrity unit that will be established within the national vet provider, ASQA, and there's 37.8 million that's been allocated to that. It's certainly not chump change, actually, that's for sure.
Yeah, not an insubstantial amount of money, is it?
Not an insubstantial amount of money at all. And given that it's taxpayer money, you ought to make sure that it's being put to good use, right? Look, when that gets up and going...
I thought the thought occurred to me is that higher education providers would probably be pretty happy if they were spending that much money promoting the industry, not just on the regulation.
You would think, absolutely. Yeah, look, it's going to be interesting to see how that money rolls out for sure. And I think ASQA for a very long time has been somewhat a toothless tiger. Yeah, it's been well known to be under-resourced. It's been well known to the tips have gone in confidentially that just haven't been acted upon. And my understanding is that that's more about resource allocation than anything else. So I certainly ASQA must be smiling at the moment in terms of getting a bit more money through the front door.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yep. So from that, look, I think that'll end up getting up and going. Willis just talked about compliance blitz on unlawful behaviour. So I think that'll take some time to get the resources through the door. And then what we probably will see is a bit more of a crackdown at targeting non-genuine providers who might be exploiting international students in one way or another. And it'll be interesting to see how that shapes, because I have a feeling it'll just happen without anyone knowing. And there'll suddenly be some written up in terms of getting providers out of the marketplace, which will be a welcome thing. When I think back over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been times like this in the past where providers end up going to tribunal and the can gets kicked down the road, but they're not actually kicked out. So seeing some of that language come out, I think is a really positive thing.
It does seem like the government's running pretty hard at this.
Look, my take on it is that there's two major issues facing the government at the moment. One is the inflation, housing, cost of living crisis, which really is caused by COVID and some of the inflationary measures on the back of COVID with supply chains being broken, et cetera, et cetera. The other one is a skills crisis. And international students sit right in the middle of those two major issues. So I think if you look at these announcements in that context, I think you're absolutely right. The government's coming hard out in terms of integrity, hard out in terms of getting out the bottom feeders. But there's nothing really here there's nothing that's been mentioned in the last few days that really strikes me as eating away the core of the market. So I think you bang on the money there. There's some really loud noises being made. And if you read the releases that the government have put out, there's been some of those quotes from ministers have been quite headline grabbing in terms of the ROPs have got to stop and these sorts of things. I think there was a phrase earlier, you don't use a sledgehammer when you can use a scalpel. And I think that's what they're working towards at the moment is though the scalpeling bit is being done really well with the noise of the sledgehammer, but the sledgehammer actually has. Yeah.
Do you think the government's trying to score some political points out of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're going hard on non-compliance. Yeah, you've got to think federal governments are all about elections, are all about voters and who votes, domestics, right? So being loud in some of these international areas around rorts, perceptions of rorts, those sorts of things, I think it speaks volumes. Certainly the release of the announcement today, which was from Andrew Giles, the immigration minister, spoke at length about some of the failures of the previous Liberal government and goes to high length to highlight some of those failures and some of the failures that may have been brought through the Nixon review as well. Absolutely. I think political points is right up there with it.
I did see a headline in one of the major newspapers this afternoon where Claire O'Neill was going very specifically after Peter Dutton, who was immigration minister when a lot of these, particularly on the migration side of things, some of the criminal activity is alleged to have occurred. And so that's why I asked the question, as it feels like, of course, there are issues to be resolved, but never miss an opportunity, so to speak, either in politics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've got to knock that low-hanging fruit, right? Rob, moving on to AIC, you're going to be in Adelaide, mate. So what are you most looking forward to this year's conference?
Yeah, look, it's always an interesting time of year, isn't it? I think the highlight of AIEC is always getting to reconnect with people. This year's conference does pick up on, I think, some of those themes. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about some of those things you've just discussed, Dirk. We've got both Jason Clare and Brendan O'Connor who are going to be speaking. Annabelle Crabb's facilitating that, which is always fantastic. And then the other session I'm really looking forward to is the final session with Stan Grant, who's just a fantastic facilitator. And he's got Ashley Fell, who's going to be presenting. I've seen her present before. She's from a demographic consultancy company called McCrindle. And it's just really an interesting person when talking about trends with young people and demographics and where society as a whole is heading. So I think that's going to be a real highlight. Alongside that, all of the regulars are going to be there. I always love hearing from Kerry Ramirez and Rob Lawrence, people who are at the coalface of collecting data, talking to students and finding out what's going on the ground. And one of the other things that really struck me as interesting, they've got marketing sessions around some of the African countries. Kenya and Nigeria are on the list this year. So as usual, quite a broad conference, but then also the opportunity to get in some of the nitty-gritty of the data and the details that's out there at the moment. So very much looking forward to it. Speaking of marketing, there have been some changes to the MIP, the marketing information packages that have just come about.
Yeah, they sure have, Rob. The first point, I guess, to start off with is that for a very long time, the MIP, now EDI, has just been, for what I would say is the jewel of Australia's crown. Some of the data that we can pull out in timeframes that no other country seems to be able to do so has just been extraordinary for such a long time. So first and foremost, I think, there should be a congratulatory note there for the Australian government in the way that they manage international education data and the way that they publish it. It's been first class for a very long time. You're absolutely right. There's been an announcement and then the change has been made. So MIP through to EDI, it does mean people do need to log in to see some of the data that was available, not behind a login wall before, but it's still free as my understanding. I don't know the development pipeline on this one, but my understanding is that this will take MIP to a new level. So I'm really excited by that, and it'll be really interesting to see what the government releases over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of being able to visualize data and be able to house that data and present it in different ways. Again, it's been fantastic to this point, and I think it's only going to go further.
Data is such a hot topic. That's another one that I'm really curious to see where things are at the conference next week. There are a few topics on the list around AI and how AI is impacting things. And of course, AI is going to have a huge impact on the way that we collect and analyze data going forward. So it'll be very interesting to see if there's any overlap in those spaces and to hear what the plans are from various organisations as to how they're integrating AI into their processes. Now, finally, Dirk, the Times Higher Ed group have released their latest rankings, and this is always one that I like to watch closely. What's new in here? What's changed? What's different?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, Rob? So this is the 2024 rankings, which are actually released, in 2023. So the Times Higher Ed has been really interesting. Certainly not too much change at the top end of town in terms of 1 to 10. We're talking Oxford, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Cambridge, Princeton, Caltech, Imperial College London, UCal Berkeley, and Yale. What's been interesting, though, I think, is how Australia's fared. Australia seems to have slid I would argue, quite a bit within the Times rankings. And Phil Banney, the head of Times Higher Ed, he seems to think that there's, I guess, the isolation around COVID is really starting to show through those results. Whether we pick that up again in the next year or so is really interesting. And I think some of that slide is not going to fare well for some of those Australian universities. What's probably more interesting, though, is when you compare it against other ranking agencies. And if you go back in history, my understanding is that the Times Higher Ed and QS once had a nice little marriage and they went their separate ways. But if you compare Times with QS, and that's not to take out the Jiaoteng rankings or some of the other ones, but just the Times and QS, the top of the pops in Australia, obviously, is the University of Melbourne. In the Times, they're now ranked 37th globally. In the QS rankings, they're 14th. Any commonalities across that, right across the top 10. So the top 10 across both are the same, and that's Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, ANU, UQ, UNSW, Adelaide, UWA, and then outside of the group of 8, you've got UTS and Macquarie. Each of them, again, significantly different between the two, much higher in the QS than in Times. The interesting thing then is when you start talking about rankings, and we can do this every year, right? But when you start talking about methodology of rankings, what's significantly different that Australia would fare so much better in the QS versus the Times? And where are those anomalies coming out? More than that, are we going to then lead into a situation where Australian universities will use the QS rankings as their major ones that they promote, hang their hat on, hang their coat on, and hang their tails on, as opposed to the Times, where then you'll see other parts of the world favouring more the Times. So it's really, in my way, it's added to that question of how, I don't want to say valid, because valid's maybe not the right word, but how intricate or how accurate are some of these rankings in a consistent way. And again, going to your point, if you're looking at grading institutions and where's my uni, and you're sitting in South Asia or Southeast Asia and you look at these two rankings, you've got to be scratching your head, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just creates confusion, particularly amongst potential students who look at two similar rankings, and there can be such a disparity. Some institutions rising on one and falling on the other.
Absolutely. Look, the University of Western Australia is a really interesting one. So in the Times, they're 143 in the world. In QS, they're 72. So they're half or twice as good in the QS as what they are in the Times. So again, that kid sitting overseas looking at that institution would really have some questions.
It's such a good one, isn't it? The comment, I had a comment on my YouTube channel on choosing a uni a little while ago where a student was asking questions about universities in Melbourne. We got to the end of this discussion, and he was from India, and he said, "Which one's got the best cricket club?" And that to me always just struck me as this reminder that these things are so personal. For some people, if you're going in to do research work, then having a higher weighting on the research side is obviously critical. And for other people, their priorities are different. Perhaps some divergence in those results maybe isn't a bad thing, as long as students are easily able to identify the differences and work out how those are relevant to them.
Yeah, absolutely. To that point, when I used to go out on the road recruiting way back in the day, I actually used to tell kids, do up a spreadsheet. Across the top, what are your 10 most important indicators that you're after? And it could be a cricket club, or it could be something to do with sport. It could be academics. It could be a social experience. It could be location. It could be all sorts of different metrics. And then put the institutions in the left-hand column and research them all based on your own metrics, because that's where you're going to find the best fit for yourself.
Absolutely. Dirk, thank you so much, as always, for keeping us up to date with all of the Australian international education news. And for those of you listening along, you can subscribe to the Koala News at thekoalanews.com. And I understand you're having a few days off?
We are. We're coming to the end of the school holidays over here in Perth, and the family and I are going away for 3 nights camping. Really looking forward to it. Heading down south just past Mandurah. So just the greater area of Perth. It's going to be tops. The weather's going to be great. Looking forward to it.
Have a fantastic time, and we'll hear you next time on the podcast. See you later, Dirk.
Thanks, Rob. See you.
The Global Horizons podcast is brought to you by the Global Society, Australia's learning abroad support company. For about 10 years, the Global Society has been supporting Australian learning abroad teams with technology, training, consulting, strategy, marketing, you name it. We all know that learning abroad is time-consuming and complex, so if your team could use a little bit of extra support, reach out to the Global Society, globalsociety.com.au.